I think the message is don't give up. I think so many cases I've seen have been driven by the persistence of a family member who refused to give up. And we see that, certainly in Ashley HeavyRunner's case, Sarah Turney advocating for her sister. That's why that case went to trial. I have no doubt. We see that time after time, and you really have to be the person speaking for the missing persons, because I think the cases that are missing persons cases and probably homicides that don't get the attention they deserve are the ones where there is not that advocate, that family member really trying to move the case forward.
That's Tad DiBiase, a former federal prosecutor who specializes in nobody homicide cases. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. In the first half of my conversation with Tad, we talked about how nobody homicide cases work in theory, how investigators recognize them, how prosecutors build them, and why they can succeed even without remains. In the second half, today, we're going to shift to what happens in practice, the critical first days of an investigation, what families can do to preserve evidence, and what specific cases like those of the Lyon sisters, Kristen Smart, Alyssa Turney, Jermain Charlo, and Ashley HeavyRunner reveal about why some cases break open and why others stall. Tad, I want to just pick up where we were talking before. We were talking about one of the real powerful pieces of circumstantial evidence that can be used in no-body homicide cases relates to sort of the discrepancies in statements made by defendants to investigators, to friends, and how a lot of people in law enforcement are a little bit jaded, so they don't think of it as a big deal, but in front of a jury, it can be really impactful. Now, it may not be that they committed the crime, but clearly there's something going on here, and I could see how law enforcement could get a little jaded. I'm curious for you. You brought up that point about how it really matters at the earliest stage of the investigation, and that really, I heard you talk at CrimeCon about those critical pieces of evidence that are really important that you need to prioritize, like digital trails. What are your thoughts around those early days and weeks to both figure out, hey, is this a missing persons case I should pay attention to, like you were talking about before, and what evidence should we try to get early on?
Yeah, it really is important to get that evidence early on. There's the show, The First 48, and it talks about, some statistics about how a case percentage being solved goes down significantly after the first 48 hours. And I don't know statistically whether that's true or not, but I know anecdotally not treating something like a murder or not knowing about it, which of course is often what happens in a missing persons case. You don't know exactly when the person went missing. Not having that evidence can be critical to not solving the case. And so what you want officers to prioritize early on are, the first thing you mentioned, digital evidence for sure. You have to make sure, do I have their cell phone? Can I access their cell phone? Can I get their phone records to see who they called? Can I see where they were? Cell tower records? Am I able to see text messages, photos, those types of things? Sometimes you can get those. Sometimes you have to use a grand jury subpoena. You have to usually act pretty quickly because companies get rid of this information because it's just a data clog for them that they don't need. Phone companies don't really care who you're calling. They don't care what your text messages are. They don't care what your photographs are. So it's getting that stored is not going to be for very long. You also need to get into whatever the potential crime scene is. where did she live? Where did a suspect live, be it a boyfriend, husband, whatever? Where's her car? Can I get into her work location, which is usually easier than a home location, because a work location is generally controlled by the employer and that you don't necessarily have to get a search warrant. And so getting into those locations, getting a search warrant in those locations is really, really critical, because if you are looking for signs of a cleanup, the signs of a cleanup 1 day, 3 days, a week later are completely different than the signs of a cleanup a month later. A month later, I'm not going to smell bleach. I'm not
Right.
going to look around and say, God, these walls look like they just got painted. That is something that being there in the moment enables you to see that, right away. I'm able to see, well, why are these clothes washed? Why is there bleach here? A month later, the person may have gotten rid of the cleaning supplies. And so now you're forced to go look at stores and say, did this person buy this here? That
Much
is a
harder.
much, much harder challenge. But that is often the challenge in a no body murder case, is you don't know when exactly the murder happened. Now, what we are learning with the electronic trail, we have much tighter time deadlines than we used to have. If you're talking about someone who disappeared in 1970, 1980, even 1990, you couldn't really say this is exactly when they disappeared. But now you can kind of tell they sent no more text after this date and this time. Now, maybe they were doing something and they disappeared 5 hours after that. But for the most part, in our society, most people, particularly, I'm 61, people younger than me are using their phones, even more than I do, which is a fair amount. They're certainly texting more. They're looking at their phone. They're looking at videos, TikTok, whatever. You're going to.
And even when they lose their phones, they'll find someone else's phone.
Yes,
No, right.
exactly. And you're just going to have that electronic tick mark that says, this is when this happened. And that is incredibly valuable to investigators. And one of the things I've noticed the last few years doing this is it used to be a long time from disappearance to arrest to trial. It could be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 40 years in the case of some cases. That timeline has significantly shrunk. And I've seen a handful, not a lot, but a handful of cases that have gone from missing, arrest, trial within a year, which would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, because you're able to tell quickly, hey, this person is actually something bad happened. I mean, if I didn't text my wife or my 2 kids or 3 stepkids, if I didn't text any of them for 24 hours, there'd be some serious alarm bells going off. No one had heard from me. If I didn't show up for work, that's the type of thing that immediately. Now, that also is partially my victimology is very different from some other people. But the fact is, most people these days have a phone. Even it's not even so much a socioeconomic thing. Most people across the socioeconomic spectrum have a phone. And that's going to leave a serious indication and a significant indication that we didn't have previously.
Right. No, that makes complete sense. In those jurisdictions where, let's say they have flood of missing persons cases, or for whatever reason, law enforcement early on isn't taking it super seriously, that there may be foul play, is there something you'd recommend to families or loved ones to do to preserve, to try and any steps that they can take if sort of law enforcement comes around in a couple weeks or something else like that? We can't be investigators, but are there any things that, people can do?
There's a couple things families can do. One, the most important is be a squeaky wheel. It is very important to have constant outreach. You're not bothering anyone. This is what the police are supposed to do, solve crimes. And if you feel like, you know better than anyone else if your loved one is missing or if likely something bad happened to them. So I think that's thing number one, is being very persistent with the police. I think in terms of other things is to make sure that you can lock down their media accounts to the extent that you can. I've seen a number of cases where people have gone into the missing person's social media and either deleted things, changed things, or poked around and looked for things in there. That is not helpful. If there is a way, either going through the company or by doing it yourself, because you can get the password and you can change it to something that you control without looking or changing any of the media, that's going to be very, very important. If you have text messages from your loved one or from people you think may be involved, snap photos of that. Take a photo of it so it doesn't go away. You know, some of these things, Snapchat, WhatsApp, they disappear, right? If you don't get a record of it, it disappears and it may disappear forever. So you want to be able to keep those records to the extent that you can. And I particularly emphasize electronics because of what I just talked about how those electronic devices leave such a precise and important indication of when the person was last alive.
Yeah. I can think of a case that I'm aware of where a person was very clearly missing, you know, and then all of a sudden 2 weeks in, their phone sent a message to someone.
Yeah.
And that message happened to make the suspect look a lot better, or like the suspect couldn't have done it.
Yeah, you see that because sometimes the suspect has the victim's phone and continues to monitor it, continues to use it. I've seen many cases like that. And those are ones where you really have to try and lock down what they're doing so that the suspect cannot access the social media or the phone itself from the victim. So if there's a way to lock the phone, you know, you need to try and do that. And of course, it's difficult because if it's an adult, you know, their family may not have access. I don't know how my family would lock down my phone. I mean, maybe they know the password, probably not. But you have to try and make that effort because that is the critical piece of information that you don't want to be doing.
You want to preserve that.
Absolutely.
I suspect that if there's a will, there's a way.
Yes, I think so. And sometimes companies are accepting of saying, hey, this is an emergency. And that's a good thing that the police can do. Most police have contacts at the major social media companies that are set up just to help law enforcement. And they can at least lock down an account and say, no one can touch this account. And we'll wait to get a subpoena or whatever the police want us to do.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense to me, to try and preserve as much as you can of that digital record early on, and at least have it there for the police, because that is certainly one of the things that if it's missing, it's a real sort of missed opportunity. I wanted to also ask you just in general about sort of like, you know, we talked about the cases where we've talked about a number of cases where it's gone relatively well. There are other cases, obviously, where it hasn't. Is there any advice you would have for a prosecutor going into trial strategy to sort of increase, because you're the numbers guy, you've obviously looked at the numbers, to increase the likelihood that you jump those two hurdles?
I think the best way is recognizing early on that this case is likely to be a circumstantial evidence case and getting the jury comfortable from the get-go that circumstantial is not some lesser quantum of evidence. It's not some shitty evidence as opposed to like an eyewitness, because as we're
in fact, I think it's the best evidence.
Absolutely.
Like, that eyewitnesses
not great. Yeah.
Right? No. You know, direct evidence, physical evidence. I mean, I've really come to believe over time that circumstantial is the best because it tells a story.
Yes. But you got to get a jury to understand that, because jurors are not versed in how bad eyewitness testimony can be, how, you know, other photo spreads and things like that, lie detectors, even though they're not generally admissible. There's a lot of fallacies out there that jurors may not understand, but people in law enforcement know, hey, you know, lie detectors aren't foolproof by any means. And so explaining to them, hey, this is what circumstantial evidence is. This is how it's treated in the law. It's treated in every court as the same as direct evidence. I think that's number one. Number two is putting together the case, which is going to require a lot of pieces because it is circumstantial evidence. You usually need more pieces of evidence. And having the jury solve the case with you is going to go a long way towards keeping them invested and keeping them understanding that this is a big puzzle and the prosecutor is going to be putting these puzzle pieces in and we're all going to be solving it together. And at the end, we're going to be missing pieces of the puzzle. We are not going to have the body. We are not going to know exactly how she was killed. We may not know exactly when she was killed, although, as I noted earlier, that's becoming more common to have a fixed time when you're pretty sure the person was killed. But getting the jury comfortable with that going in is really, really important. It's also really important, and I talk to prosecutors about this all the time. You have to have a question during jury selection where you say, if the government proved this case beyond a reasonable doubt that Tad DiBiase committed this murder, but there's no body, could you still vote to convict? And anyone who says no is boop off your jury. They're off by the court because you've preloaded that question by saying the government proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt, which means the juror has to find them guilty, right?
Yep.
But by doing this, you take away those many people who were like, Jason Blair in 1998, who said, you can't convict this guy without a body. We want to eliminate that guy and make sure he doesn't sit on the jury. Now, there may be people who in voir dire say, well, I don't know, it might be hard, but then you're going to convince them through the evidence. But
and you've primed them to think about it already.
And the other jurors are listening to it too, which is helpful. But anyone who says, no, I couldn't, and you will find people who say, I would never convict without a body. I just can't do it. And I get that. That's your view. I'm not going to force my legal opinion on you, but you're also never going to sit, on my jury for a no body murder case.
I wanted to ask you about a couple cases. A couple years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I did a 4-part series with Allison Dixon, another podcaster, on the Catherine and Sheila Lyon case out of Montgomery County, Maryland.
Yes.
Part of the reason I explored that one was, I'm a couple years behind you, but not many. But when we were growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, Catherine and Sheila disappeared as, we were little kids. And, I remember my parents over the years talking about how, and they had gone to a mall in Montgomery County, Wheaton Mall, and disappeared. And I remember my parents for years afterwards talking about how that changed the way they raised us. And, there was obviously evidence that they had disappeared from the mall. They had walked over there, but really not any good traces or leads for decades.
Yep.
And, it's one of the cliches that in a lot of cases that go unsolved and become cold, you're going to find the name of the suspect in the first week or two of your police file. But they were, eventually able to get a conviction of Lloyd Lee Welch on a theory that he was there at the mall, convinced the girls to go into the car. They were held in his family's home in Hyattsville, Maryland. And it gets a little blurry on what happened there, but that probably at least one of them was killed there and then taken all the way to another family property in Southwest Virginia up on Taylor's Mountain. And, I just think about that case and I think about the story that the investigators were able to weave together. I can imagine it in my head. They wove it together so powerfully. I can imagine in my head the girls walk to the mall, them encountering Welch. I can even, through the witnesses that they pulled together who didn't have eyewitness testimony, I can imagine Lloyd showing up with his girlfriend and the duffel bag that probably had one of the girls in it.
Yep.
And going to the fire pit. But I think when I look at a case like that, it just feels like even a miracle. And I know he ultimately pled guilty, but I think in part because the prosecutors and the detectives, well, one, because Virginia had the death penalty. That's part of where they were taking the case. But two, they had such a powerful story to tell.
Yeah, and that to me, that is a rare nobody murder case because it was stranger on stranger, and it was an abduction of young girls. And I didn't grow up here, but I certainly, when I moved here in 91, before I was a prosecutor, before I had any interest in nobody murder cases, I knew of the case very well. It is, as you said, growing up here, it is a very well-known unsolved homicide case for many, many years here. And I think what ultimately happened was they were so persistent on the case, and eventually had some witnesses come forward who had some helpful evidence, not super damning, but very suspicious, and talked about how it was uncle and nephew, how they had acted, that really kept the police interested in them. And then ultimately, one of them, at least, I think, confessed,
Yeah.
and told the story. But that to me is a very atypical case because they didn't really have any forensic evidence. They really had some people who came forward later, which is not uncommon in an old, cold nobody case. You usually are going to solve it not through forensics, but through someone talking and feeling more comfortable talking now than maybe they used to.
Safer. Yeah.
Safer, absolutely.
Yeah.
Time has passed, and I'm not a violent criminal anymore, or a
Or
drug
I've
dealer.
moved away from the violent criminal.
I'm not in that family. Maybe I'm married out or divorced out of that family. But that to me was such an interesting and, of course, sad, sad case because it's a parent's worst nightmare. I sent my, the two girls, I think they were 10 and 12.
Yeah, 10 and 12.
Sent them to the mall, Wheaton Mall, which, we've all been to, and everybody, knows was a pretty normal mall.
Oh, yeah.
And to have that happen is just unfathomable. The good part is I think the detectives just stayed on it, and different detectives over the years. There's a colleague of mine at work, a police officer, and he told me he lives right near where the girls lived when they were growing up. And I think the family may still live there, but they left their porch light on for years in the hopes, all night, in the hopes that they would come back. And when he found out that I was interested in nobody murders, this was years ago. He just retired from our department. He told me about that case, and he just said it always just bothered him and struck him, and he kind of followed it, from afar. But he was always struck by they always leave their porch light on, just waiting for them to come back, which sadly did not happen. But that is very much an atypical case because there really wasn't a ton of evidence, but they stuck with it and ultimately got the right result.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. That fits outside of the mold of what you're sort of talking about, the stranger on stranger. A little bit closer to that is Kristen Smart's case. And,
yes.
She disappeared while in college in California at Cal Poly St. I forget which one it was.
I think it was St. Louis Obispo.
Yes, St. Louis Obispo. And that was in 1996. And, they're still searching for her body now, right? I think recently, as a couple months ago, they did a search. But years ago, they convicted Paul Flores, who was a fellow student of it. And to me, that was another interesting example of a no-body homicide case where I think it was very different for me because I almost felt like that part where you have to prove that the person actually died. In that case, by the time they brought that, no one was even thinking about that question. But maybe I'm wrong on that. What are your thoughts on that one?
So I think in that case, what made it so interesting is he was a suspect pretty early on.
Last person to see her, I think.
Yeah, and had walked her home or something, or said he'd walked her home. And they, again, as with the Lyon sister cases, they just stuck with it and refused to let the case, die, for lack of a better term. And that persistence, I think, ultimately, paid off because they did get some evidence, as I'm recalling now, some forensic evidence and maybe some evidence that the body had been moved. I think they had a cadaver dog hit. And it's the same thing that this is, again, somewhat atypical. They did not appear to have any relationship. They appeared to know each other. But I don't think had any dating relationship. But he saw her at a party. She may have been drinking, and he offered to walk her home. But again, went 30 years, 25 years almost, before they solved it. And again, before the advent of any electronic evidence and all of that, it just goes to show you that despite the passage of time, despite the fact of not finding a body, and they'll only find a body if one of these guys says what happened. And again, I think in this case, it was a father and a son, wasn't it?
Yep.
Which is interesting because I would think, I love my children, but if one of them came and said, "Hey, Dad, can you help me out? I got this body I got to get rid of," I'd be like, "No, thanks.
Like I got a great idea for you. It does not involve me."
Yeah. So, but that's just another, a case that shows even these long-term missing persons cases that we suspect are homicides still have a chance of being solved. And that's very optimistic to me, because a lot of families wonder, is this ever going to be solved? And that shows that it can, in a non-traditional, at least for the last 25 years, non-traditional type of homicide, because you don't have a lot of the evidence we would have today. You can imagine today this case would have been so much easier to solve, right? We would have gotten the kids' cell phone and all that. We would have gotten Kristen's. We would have known they were
geofence, right? We would have found everybody else's cell phone.
We would have found everyone else who was there, and they would have come forward and said, "Oh yeah, I did see them together." It's just that case today is solved within weeks, I suspect.
Yeah.
Even though they didn't seem to have a prior relationship, just their electronic trail that they left behind alone is likely going to point to him as a very strong suspect early on. They had him as a suspect early on, but they didn't really have anything they could tie him to until they started to look, I think, a little more closely at the family and what might be. Again, potentially buried at a location that is well known to them, because I think he was initially put in the house or buried somewhere near the house.
Yeah. And Doug McGregor always says that, it's going to be, he's a geographic profiler. It's going to be somewhere. Oh, you know Doug. Okay. He's a great guy.
In fact, I got to go on his podcast. He's asked me.
Oh, awesome.
I need to set a date. Yeah, no, great.
We just had him on a couple months ago. So it all comes around. We should start a club, it sounds like. Right?
All the people have been on each other's podcasts.
Right. Well, he always says that, it's probably going to be somewhere near a place that the person knows. Now, the natural place you think of is their work. You think of their home. You think about the corridors between them, but also think about grandma's house. Think about what they do on, all of those kinds of things.
Or places where people hunt, or places where they explored the woods as a little kid. He's 100% right that there's a study that I referenced very briefly at CrimeCon, where they did a study in Washington State about last known location. And basically the summary is the median distance when they did find the body is 6 miles from the last known location, which in the scheme of things is not real far. It's hard to search a 6-mile radius around a place, but that gives you some idea of how close. It's not, you'd think if you killed someone and wanted to get rid of the body, you'd go like 200 miles away, but they don't, because they can't be missing for that long. They can't be out of their life for that long. They don't want to have a body in the car, because God forbid you get pulled over
a lot of risk
by a trooper, and it's like, shit, I got a body in the trunk of my car. Not good. And so we do find that the location is known to the suspect and often not very far.
Those are all good points. I also think another factor might be criminals are just lazy like the rest of us.
Yes, exactly. I don't want to drive that. I don't want to drive that far.
That's crazy.
Go 2 miles. It's good.
Well, and it also, I think, in my exploring Ashley's case, one thing about that really sort of changed my perspective a little bit was it made me find out so much more about the suspects' lives that I think I've gotten to the point where I know things about their lives that they don't even know.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, we're in a good spot here. I hate to bring this up, but sort of like the contra case to these cases is one, the Alyssa Turney disappearance.
Yes.
She disappeared, I think it was around 2000.
Yep.
In the last few years, her stepfather, Michael Turney, was brought to trial, and the judge ultimately ruled, I believe he ruled, where his decision was essentially, that the state had done a good enough job proving that she's likely dead, but not by a criminal act necessarily, and definitely not Turney. Any thoughts on what went wrong in that case and cases like that?
Yeah, so that case I know quite well. I worked on that case when it was a case examination at NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Yep.
And I know Sarah Turney personally. I think the challenge in that case, one, the judge took it away from the jury and reached the decision on his own, which is has not happened very often. I actually saw it happen in a case in Virginia within the last year. And I remember at the time thinking with the Virginia case, boy, it's never happened before. And then I remembered Alyssa Turney's case where it did happen. That is exceedingly rare. And I am not necessarily a fan of trying cases in front of judges for that very reason. I also think in that case, having worked on it, the evidence...
Because on that point, is that because once the judge, you're trying it in front of the judge becomes the trier of both the facts and the law.
Yes.
And that can be a dangerous combination for any prosecutor.
It's one person deciding, and the value of the jury system is we put 12 people together. They have different viewpoints. They come from different walks of life. They all live in the same county or city in DC.
They discuss it. They open each other's minds.
Exactly. It's like to me, do I reach a good decision if I sit there and noodle on it myself, or do I reach a good decision if I talk to my 2 deputy general counsels about it? The answer is always it's better if I run it past them. I think about it, I get their input. I may not agree with them, but I may ultimately say, yeah, you raised some good points. That's almost how always the best decisions are made, not groupthink of everyone thinking the same thing, or God forbid, one person just saying, oh, I know better. I never wanted to agree to bench trials to the detriment of sometimes judges being mad about it. But I'm like, I'm sorry, judge. I want 12 people deciding this because they're going to reach a better conclusion. It may be the conclusion that I don't agree with, because I certainly have had acquittals in murder cases, but it's the best judgment of all the people. It's like, that's why we don't appoint kings. We have a democracy where we all vote and we, make our choice. So I didn't like that in that case. That said, I do think the evidence pointing to Michael was very tough. There wasn't a lot there. He was a extraordinarily troubled person. He had a lot of issues. He had been jailed previously or imprisoned for all these bombs that he had and these threats he had made. He was such a controlling person, which is a classic personality of a nobody domestic murder.
And he's not bathing himself in glory now either.
No, but the actual tie in the timing of tying him to when Alyssa went missing was very, very difficult. Again, a case today in 2026, he's arrested much more quickly because we're going to be able to see exactly where he went in the desert, what time he went, when Alyssa stopped texting on her phone, all of those things. But back in 2000, that just didn't exist. So that to me, not just because I know Sarah and I worked on the case. It was very difficult when I heard the verdict. But while I didn't like the verdict, I can see how a reasonable judge could reach that verdict.
Mm-hmm. Same here. I came into that one, I think, thinking I hadn't been too familiar with the case, but I came in thinking when I was seeing the news coverage in advance, they're probably going to get a conviction on this. And then I remember listening to the opening and maybe the first few witnesses from the prosecutor. I remember messaging another podcaster right now and saying, oh my God, this is going to go off the... I hadn't even realized at that point that it was just a bench trial, but I was like, I think it's pretty clear that she's dead, but I think trying to make the connection to him, even though he looks so right for it,
yes,
was going to be very, very difficult. And I think that's a tough thing for prosecutors too. So, I don't want to be too hard on the prosecutors. To some extent, maybe if they had waited longer, they could have gotten more. But how do you make that call, right? Like, because there becomes a point where you sort of have to say, I'm probably not going to get anything better than what I have right now.
Yeah. And I will say, I don't remember exactly what year I looked at it. I want to say 2013, 2014. And we had the two detectives come down. One, I remember Stuart Summershoe, who gave the presentation. The case that ultimately went to trial hadn't really changed that much from what they had back then. They had a few more things which were good and helpful, but it wasn't significantly different. And at the time when I was looking at it with the other folks at NECMEC, I think we all felt like you don't have it yet. You're getting close, but you don't have it. And then to go to trial with a little bit more, but not a whole lot more, I think presented some challenges for sure.
Yeah, and it's tough too, right? Because in a lot of local prosecutor situations, one state's attorney or district attorney may have a very different view than another, and that can either slow or speed or where resources are thrown. I also wanted to ask you about some other sort of well-known cases where bodies haven't been found and charges. And you mentioned that you knew Jermain's case really well. I know Ashley's case really well. And, those cases where there's a disappearance and where, nobody has been found, at least publicly, let's say nobody has been identified yet. I'm just curious in those cases, in thinking about those two cases, what kind of threshold do you think prosecutors and investigators need to have or are looking to have to pull the trigger? And I'll just speak from just a personal perspective, knowing that on Ashley's case and Jermain's case, maybe in the beginning it didn't go perfectly in either of those cases, but certainly the latter investigators who got on that case have clearly been very good at their jobs, clearly care very deeply about the cases. So often you see situations where, you get frustrated by law enforcement's efforts or their competence, but we're not dealing with not enough competence on either of those cases or not enough effort on either of those cases. They really are truly impressive. And I hope someday we get to see some of these investigators. We won't see them on the stand because they're both going to be in federal court, but we get to hear about them more. But what do you think they need to get to the point where they can prosecute or?
So let me first say, Jermain Charlo's case I worked on years ago. I've kept up with the investigator on the case, Guy Baker out of Missoula, over the years, and he's kept me up to date on the case.
And he's the first investigator I've ever seen who's posted his cell phone number on a billboard.
Yes, he's amazing. You are exactly right. He's an amazing investigator. He's amazingly passionate about that case, and I suspect probably all of his cases. And generally, I never talk about the cases I work on. That is the agreement I have with the police and with the prosecutors. The two exceptions are the cases that we've talked about, which is the Alyssa Turney case, where Sarah gave me permission to talk about the case, and Sarah and I are actually going to be on a documentary that's coming out, I think, late this year or early next year about the case. And then Guy Baker has said, I can talk about Jermain Charlo. I don't talk about the specific evidence, but the fact of working on it. And I think the challenge in Jermain's case, I think, is that there are a number of suspects that have to be eliminated before the strongest suspect, who I will not name, can truly kind of go forward in that case. I think there is a suspect that we believe is the one responsible for her disappearance, but there are also a lot of these other suspects out there, which is not uncommon in a no-body murder case, because your suspect pool in a no-body murder case is much larger. If I find a woman dead in her home with no indication of a break-in, my suspect pool is relatively limited. Who could have come in the home?
Yeah.
But if I don't know where Jermain Charlo was exactly when she disappeared, my suspect pool is much, much larger. It's almost like the entire United States is your suspect pool, because
Right.
I don't know who was there that day. It's not like someone
Certainly everyone between the bar and the different places that who I would guess is the prime suspect said that she could have been dropped off.
Yes, yeah. It's a large suspect pool. And because of, she may have been using drugs, that enters up into a whole different potential victimology. All of those things make it harder in the typical no-body murder case, but particularly their case of both Ashley and Jermain, because we don't know exactly when they went missing. In Ashley's case, there's some evidence that maybe she was alive like up to 3 days after we thought she really disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
There's some evidence that maybe she was alive. Not great evidence, not super credible, but not absurd evidence. And that makes it so challenging, because now you're saying, well, I thought she disappeared here at this location at this time, but if she actually disappeared here, this is a whole nother group of people that could have been involved. That's the challenge, I think.
And as a prosecutor, I know I have to disprove that second version.
And in the best case scenario, I disprove that version in a pretrial hearing with a judge who says, defense, you're not bringing that in. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is I got to disprove these other people, what I call killer X, other killers. I got to disprove them at trial. If you're doing that at trial, you're in trouble, Jack, because that's not the way you want your case to go.
Defense attorney dream.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. That I can point to all these other, potential people. So to me, that is often the challenge in some of these cases where we're positive it's a murder.
The problem of too many suspects.
Yeah, eliminating these other suspects. I have two similar cases I'm working on now where there are some other suspects, other decent suspects. Do I have one that I think did it? Yes. Do I have one that a skilled defense attorney could make look like a really good suspect? Absolutely. Because the defense doesn't have to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't have to prove anything at all. They just have to throw enough mud. And I think that's the challenge in, particularly Jermain's case, that are there other people that could have been involved, that could have done it. I will say this, if there's anyone who can solve that case, it's Guy Baker, given the work he's put in.
I've been really impressed by what I've heard about him. I was saying to someone months ago, he's the kind of guy I think I would love to know or sit down with, or he just seems like a truly dedicated, caring, and smart investigator. Do you think in either of those cases, if the bodies were found, because we're talking such a long period, do you think it would make a difference?
Yes.
Assuming they're, you tell me.
There's never a downside to finding a body. None.
Okay.
Because at the worst case, you say someone deposited the body here. That's the worst. That's the least information you can get, right? I don't know how they were killed. I don't know exactly when they were killed, although in these cases we would, because we know about when they each disappeared. But knowing that these remains here, even if I can't tell cause of death, I know someone either committed the murder here or put the body here. That is valuable evidence in and of itself. Why? Because of what Doug McGregor and I have said. The body is going to be deposited in a place familiar to the suspect. So once I know where that place is, I think, who would have put the body here? It's a data point that is super helpful. And so while I think you could certainly try a case without a body, while I think there's a time to say, let's go forward if we have enough evidence and we're never going to find the body, absent, some incredible circumstances like a confession or something like that, I have always said it is always, always, always better to have the body.
Yeah, I have hope in both of those cases, actually, for actually a lot of hope on
I do too.
finding the
I do
bodies
too.
in those cases, and also the cases being closed eventually or resolved or whatever version of it is.
Well, and also to be fair, having these podcasts help. It just keeps the word out there. Whenever I mentioned during my presentations about MMIW, I have to think about it for a second, missing and murdered Indigenous women. You mention Ashley HeavyRunner, Jermain Charlo. People know those names now.
Yep.
10 years ago or whenever, I guess they didn't disappear quite 10 years ago, although almost for both.
It's about, yeah.
People didn't care about those cases. There is much greater recognition of the problem we have with these missing and murdered women, Indigenous women, Native American, First People in Canada, that didn't exist. And this type of publicity, this type of interest by people, I think can only help. Why? Because as we mentioned earlier, people change. They become unenamored of the suspect. They become divorced from the suspect. They break off a relationship. And those are people who hear these things and say, I ought to say something about this. I know something about this because he said something to me one time. He said, I hope you don't end up like so-and-so who I got rid of. I can get rid of people. Those are the type of quotes that regenerate the investigation and sometimes are enough to push those investigations from we don't have guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to now maybe we do, because Big Mouth shot off his mouth, wanted to be a big man, wanted to talk about, how he controls his women or whatever. And now we do have enough information.
Right. And somebody makes the connection. I can think of a great example in Ashley's case that sort of gave them a new location to search. And it all came down to, and it was really interesting, someone had their TV playing on in the background. They lived up in Anchorage, had their TV playing on the background and heard the name of a suspect and thought, wait a second. I found a bunch of mail from a squatter who is staying at the house that she and her husband had bought. And that was right around the time that happened. And it was just this woman who, had the TV playing on in the background.
Wow.
And just caught the name and was like, wait a second, and made the connection and reached out. And I really do think getting publicity around the cases, matters, because I've seen certain cases where we've done episodes on and, people who have cadaver dogs have volunteered and gone and connected with people, where forensic people have offered their time, or even profilers who offered their time to agents or to families. And I think it really does make a difference. And every time one of these no body cases gets solved, I think it gives people hope.
Yes.
And I think it gives the families hope when they see these things. So,
Yep.
Well, I know it gives them hope.
Absolutely. And it's really important. I tell detectives working on these cases, this is going to be the hardest case of your career. Until you get another no body murder case, this is it. And you have to work these cases like you've never worked a case. You have to be persistent. You have to think outside the box. What else can I do in this case? Because that's what these cases require. But as we've shown 650 times, these cases can be brought to trial. Not all of them, but more than we're bringing now. We can close some more of these out.
Yeah. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I wanted to ask you just one more thing
Sure.
before we go. And I think it kind of ties back to that idea of hope. Like, I think you've laid out some really important things here, the elements of how these cases can be solved, the right things that law enforcement or family members can do in the beginning, how important sort of storytelling is, even jury selection, all of those things I think are super helpful. But I think that part I'm just curious about for you, because I can just tell by what you're saying, like, you care about homicide, you care about these kinds of crimes, you care about the victims, you care about their family members. If there's any message that you would have for family members whose loved ones are missing and there probably was foul play, and there's that ambiguous grief that they're dealing with because
Yes.
they don't even know what to mourn or what to
Yep.
do. Like, what message would you have for them?
I think the message is don't give up. I think so many cases I've seen have been driven by the persistence of a family member who refused to give up. And we see that, certainly in Ashley HeavyRunner's case, Sarah Turney advocating for her sister. That's why that case went to trial. I have no doubt. We see that time after time. And you really have to be the person speaking for the missing persons, because I think the cases that are missing persons cases and probably homicides that don't get the attention they deserve are the ones where there is not that advocate, that family member really trying to move the case forward. When I was at CrimeCon, we talked about a case that's on a podcast called Hide and Seek, and the victim's father was there with me, Brittany Wallace, and her dad was there. And he was just so emotional in front of the audience, talking to them about, his missing daughter. And it, to me and the audience, it was so moving. But it's his passion for it and saying, I am not going to quit. He knows in his head how many days it's been since the last time he saw her before she, when she disappeared. He saw her, I think, about a week or so before she disappeared. And that just came through so clearly. And I thought, this guy is never going to let this case go, which is what the case needs. It just needs someone to continue to say, I am not going to quit on this case. And it's the very rare time. I don't think I've ever met a family member in person that I can think of from a no-body case, because once I start working on the case, I don't communicate with the family. I don't do any of that.
Right.
In this case, I'm not technically working with the police. I'm working with this podcast. So it was the first time that I had met, Greg Wallace. And I was just so impressed by his, persistence and his trying to figure out what happened. That's what I would say to any family member: continue to have that persistence.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've met him a couple times actually at CrimeCon and heard about that case. My heart just goes out to them and they amaze me with their persistence. And it doesn't mean that every family member needs to do that, because they need to do whatever it is that causes them to heal. But I agree with you on that point. It's their efforts, and I know sometimes they feel like they're screaming into the wilderness.
Yes.
But their efforts really do matter.
They do.
They really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
It has exponential, I think, impact on and the interesting part, being someone in the journalistic world, right?
Yep.
I straddle both sides, right? Like, I occasionally have access to law enforcement. I occasionally have access to them. And very often, if I'm working on something over the long term, can't necessarily share everything both ways. But it's really interesting in those moments where I'm straddling both sides, where I think about the family members. I'm like, you have no earthly idea how much of an impact. Like, I think of one example where I just can tell that the investigator on the case is so, even though they cannot say this, they're so connected to, the efforts of the family that they're just not going to let it go because of that.
Yep.
And I think that stuff really does matter.
Impressive.
Well, thanks for coming on, Tad. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to connecting again, hopefully in Orlando or in DC, since we're both in the
we're
area.
Not that far apart. I wouldn't mind connecting at all. That'd be
great. Coffee on me at any point.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining Tad and I for this second part of our conversation. And I wanted to thank all of the members of our Patreon. You're critical to making this podcast work. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with me and the live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again.